Henry Wardry was unfortunate enough to be on monitoring duty when the convict went crazy. He was there before the monitor, watching Estevan, making sure once again that yes, he had been right. It really was Jency's brother when suddenly his head began to hurt. God damn it, migraines, he thought, must be something to do with the artificial atmosphere in the dome. He never suffered from migraines before. He closed his eyes tight, pinched the bridge of his nose, and waited for the pain to subside. After a few seconds it did, even if only just slightly, and he opened his eyes to see suddenly a strange flicker on one of the monitors. He adjusted the camera slightly and at first couldn't believe what he was seeing. He focused in and then thought, oh shit, when he realized what he was seeing was a man's arm with a fork sticking out of it. And then he watched the man's hand close around the fork and tug it out of the arm, which in some ways seemed like a very sensible thing to do. Even if the arm did start bleeding profusely, what was less sensible was the fact that he immediately stuck it in again, even deeper than this time. Henry had never seen anything like it. There hadn't been a single disturbance since he had arrived, no real fights, almost no suicides, and every little violence except the rare times when the guards were sent in to retrieve one of the inmates and bring him to the interrogation chamber. Since hell was their last stop, most of the convicts had already been pretty thoroughly wrung out from before arriving here, and most were political prisoners rather than hardened cons. He was reaching for the button to alert the guards, watching one of the other prisoners rushing toward the man who was stabbing himself with the fork. When the man tugged the fork out again and buried it in his neck this time, and then pitched backward off the bench. After that he could see very little. A man was leaning over the injured prisoner, perhaps trying to give him first aid, and was blocking the camera's view of him. He did not remember having pushed the button for the guards, but he must have, for there was a violence in his earpiece now, talking to him, asking him what was up. Stuttering, he tried to explain what he had just seen, prisoner inflicting violence on himself for no discernible reason, and having collapsed, probably gravely injured. And then the man who had been administering first aid moved back, and the camera could see again, and there was no question in his mind but that the man who had stabbed himself was dead. Henry sat there a little shocked, or perhaps a lot shocked. Hard to say. He stared numbly at the body, just as all the prisoners were staring and standing in a circle around it. There was Estevan again, and he could see him. He didn't look traumatized or stressed, seemed hardly surprised, just stood there with his face expressionless, staring on. And then suddenly he thought he caught the flicker of a smile. He's crazy, thought Henry. Maybe they're all crazy. He was glad that he was not one of the guards, that he wouldn't have to be one of the ones to go in there. He had to stay watching the prisoners until one of the monitors showed him the guards lined up behind the door, ready to go in. Then he triggered the alarm, telling the prisoners to return to their cells. A few of them did, but most of them were still standing there, still in shock, maybe. So he followed protocol and turned on the loudspeaker and turned the volume all the way up and gave them their one warning. There was a little confusion, but in the end all of them returned to the cells except for one. He considered issuing the warning again, but no, he knew the rules. He wasn't to do that. So he closed the cell doors and then called down and warned the guards that there was a corpse and one loose inmate, and that inmate looked stunned, wasn't likely to be a real threat. And then when he'd had acknowledgement, he opened the doors and watched them rush in. They beat the loose inmate unconscious. There was no need for it, no reason to do it, and it made Henry think again that he'd made a very bad choice by taking this job, by coming to this planet out in the middle of nowhere to live in the outer circle of a penal colony that not only the prisoners but the guards too called hell. He watched two guards. He couldn't tell which two because of the riot gear they wore, drag the unconsciousness man away and deposit him in the ring with the cells in it. Meanwhile, the three remaining guards miled around the corpse. Henry's earpiece crackled. What are we to do with the body?" asked the leader on the monitor. Henry saw him turn and stare up at one of the cameras. "What do you usually do with the bodies?" asked Henry. "This is the first one I've had, sir, since they converted the morgue to an interrogation room." The man said, "Don't call me sir." Henry wanted to say, "I'm not one of you," but he knew if he said it, it would only confuse the man. Plus, he wasn't absolutely sure that it was true. In a sense, he was as guilty as the soldiers who had beaten the loose inmate unconscious. "Isn't there a protocol?" he asked. "Not that I am aware of, sir. Before we left them in the morgue and someone collected them." "Who collected them?" asked Henry. "I don't know," said the man. "Someone from that other complex, the one we don't talk about." Well, we can't leave the body there," said Henry. "Bring it inside and put it somewhere until we can figure out what to do. The interrogation room, maybe. I'll contact the commander, see what he suggests." Once the body was inside, lying flat on one of the metal tables in the interrogation room, Henry established the link. It took a few minutes for it to go through the satellite that directed the signal, first having to assure itself that the link was authorized, and then having to encrypt the signal and send the decryption code securely to the vessel circling the planet. It had always seemed strange to Henry that almost all of the military personnel lived not within the outer ring of the prison, but in orbit around the planet. It wasn't as though there wasn't enough room for them here. but maybe they felt freer where they were, or maybe from their vantage they could keep watch not only for over the panel colony, but over the other complex that had been built not far away. Henry had no idea what it was or what purpose it served. It had only caught a glimpse of it when the shuttle landed him here, and then if the lights was just right, or the darkness deep and hazelless, he could see its glimmer there at a distance. But he knew it was there, and knew if it was out here in the middle of nowhere, whatever was going on inside of it wasn't anything he wanted any part of it. Eventually the line crackled, and he saw the face of one of the ensigns, a thin, awkward fellow with a prying mouth or other, read the name over his pocket. Suddenly, "Supply ship isn't here yet," said Ensign Arthur. "It won't arrive for a few weeks. You should have more than enough to last you until then." Jerk thought. "Henry, that's not why I calling," he said. "Oh," said the ensign. "Then why are you calling?" "I need to talk to the commander." "About what?" Henry didn't answer, just stayed silent and staring until the ensign said, "Let me see if I can erase him." The screen went blank. When it lit up again, it showed the face of the Commander Groter. He had a crew-cut and craggy face, his cheeks covered with pock marks that most people would have had surgically corrected, a scar or two, and ran from one side of the nose through his lips, and the skin splaying out slightly. "Jinx?" "No," he said. "No," said Henry, wondering. He couldn't help but feel that the commander had deliberately gotten his name wrong. "Wadri?" "Of course," the commander said, and gave a broad but lifeless smile. "Well, what do you need?" Henry explained. "A fork, you say?" said the commander, and then said, "Doesn't sound like a man with all his marbles. No indication of disturbance or madness until now," said Henry. "Most of these men have their spirits broken. Last thing most of them are up to is any violence toward others or themselves, and yet here we are. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Jenkins, you're not to blame." "Wadri, sir," said Henry, and watched a flash of irritation cross over the commander's face. "I didn't think I was to blame. I'm just not sure what to do with the body. Shall we bury it? Incinerate it?" The commander hesitated for a moment, finally shook his head. "Probably we should have someone take a look at it just in case. Store it for now." "Store it? You've got a morgue, don't you?" "We had one, sir, but it was replaced by the interrogation room." "Ah," said Groter, "I see. Well, put him in the refrigerator. We only have the ones we use for food." "Well, clear one of those out and put him in. It'll only be for a few days." "A few days," said Henry, imagining one of the guards waking up and stumbling into the kitchen and opening a door on a corpse. "Maybe sooner," said the commander. "We'll do what we can." He reached out and clicked the screen off.